Hello. As many of you will know, and some who are just new to this, watching this for the first time won't, of course, my name is John Rees. I'm a chiropractor based in Ilkley in West Yorkshire, and I'm doing a series of little videos talking about things that I think are beneficial health-wise, not necessarily just chiropractic ones, but anything to broaden everyone's health knowledge. I think it's incumbent on me as a doctor of chiropractic to provide some information. It is as substantive as I can find the data, but mostly it's about raising thoughts in one's mind and allowing you to ask questions and to verify yourself. Now, this is part 3 in our COVID conversation. And this one, we're talking about excess deaths. And later on, or shortly, I'll be showing you some various graphs and charts to make provide some information. It'll cause you perhaps to ask some questions. Some of the answers we may wish to provide you, but also you can extrapolate from the data that is in front of you. So, as we know, excess deaths is something that is monitored throughout the world in most countries of the world and based on a presumed or a natural occurrence of number of deaths per week, per month, per year, and then every 5 years, it's sort of done on a 5-year cycle, and then it's updated and extrapolated depending on the demographics of that period. What we have obviously noticed quite naturally is that in 2020, March thereof, there was a huge increase in excess deaths because in this country in particular, the arrival of COVID. Now, interestingly enough, the number of people who died around that time, bearing in mind we're sort of in the winter period, the end of the winter period, is stated to be more than would be the case, irrespective of the presence of COVID, because in 2019, the winter thereof, the number of people that one might have expected to have died because of their age and their just health situation survived because it was a very mild winter in 2019. So they sort of a number of them, and it's thought to be about 30,000 of them, kind of was still alive a year later, and therefore when COVID arrived, it was going to be a double hit, not on those people who were sort of had an expectation statistically to die in 2020, but also it might take out those who had stayed and survived for the year from 2019. However, we all know that there was a massive spike in deaths at March, April 2020 based on COVID. Interestingly enough, with regard to excess deaths, those they did occur and continue to occur across the world, resultant or even after the rollout of the COVID vaccines. And one of the things that is interesting, statistically, of course, when we had winter and when we have winter in the northern hemisphere, they obviously have their summers. And therefore, the incidence of problems with respiratory viruses is not going to hit Australia or New Zealand as badly in the summer as it would in the winter, as it was over here. Of course, with the world rushing to get a vaccine, as it turned out, in Australia and New Zealand, the increase in excess deaths that they noted statistically arrived in following the rollout of the vaccine, because at the time of the rollout of the vaccine in Australia and New Zealand, they hadn't had the arrival of the virus, strangely enough. Whereas, of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, we'd had it and then the vaccine came. So it raises perhaps even more questions as to what caused the rate of excess deaths. And we're going to be charting, excuse the pun, we're going to be going through a few graphs here, following to show you perhaps some reasons why that might be the case. Now, if we look at this chart, which as you can see is the number of coronavirus deaths in the United Kingdom in 2023. Well, actually, in fact, it goes from March 2020 to January 2023. And obviously, along the x-axis, the bottom axis, we've got the date. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we've got the number of deaths. And quite naturally, as coronavirus sort of arrived, let's say in the UK, around about March, you will see that on the left-hand axis, the increase from 0 deaths to about 25,000 is sort of almost immediate. And then through the rest of the year until the autumn time, after sort of throughout the summer, it plateaus around 45,000, which isn't unsurprising. All viruses, particularly respiratory viruses, are usually less prevalent during the summer months. However, as we know, COVID did cause numerous deaths. But what is interesting, bearing in mind also there was a huge excess death in a short period of time, and getting rid of the most vulnerable for the obvious reasons I've said, winter and this novel virus arriving. It seems strange that there's such an escalation come December or December the 7th, around this time, from about 45,000 to 135,000 in a matter of months by the end of March. Now again, you might get, as we said before, a winter peak. But why, after the commencement of the rollout of the vaccine, which happened and started on December the 7th, 2020, when we would naturally presume that you were being given something to prevent you being infected and prevent your ability to transmit it. Why, therefore, in those few months would you get over a tripling of deaths from COVID directly after the vaccine was rolled out? But again, even with the presence of the vaccine, we're still having deaths on a monthly basis so high. And up until January 2023, it is still rising at a steady state. And in actual fact, in 2022 and 2023, the summers thereof, there is no plateau of deaths. So that does raise certain questions. When we look at this chart, this graph, which is showing the number of weekly excess deaths in England and Wales from January 2020 to January 2025, quite naturally, in March 2020, when we know the virus arrived, we had this massive peak of excess deaths, and then they went down throughout the spring and summer of 2020, and in actual fact during September 2020 they're actually below the average expected. But then again, if we look at sort of November, December, January 2021, which is within a short period of time of the vaccine rollout, we get a very considerable spike, which then tails off. But even so, since which time, bearing in mind the 0 along the bottom, along the x-axis, the 0 is basically the norm, and therefore any line above the 0 is an excess of the normally expected deaths. And so predominantly throughout the spring and summer of 21, 22 and 23, we have around about or up to 2,500 excess deaths in the UK. Okay, so we're now going to go through some graphs which we've taken off a podcast by Dr. John Campbell. First, apologies for the quality of the graphs, but we literally had to photograph them off his podcast. And if you've come across Dr. John Campbell, he's been looking into the ongoing health situations for a number of years. A very interesting gentleman to listen to. I think he produces a podcast almost on a daily basis. But this one, he has come across some data from a journal, and we will illustrate the exact reference to the journal here, so you can look at it yourself, but we'll talk you through what the report says. This is the all-cause mortality from the 2010 to the current situation. But again, in 2020 and 2021, you can see that the all-cause mortality increased. This one says other natural causes of death. It doesn't define what would be included in those actual other natural causes of death, but again, it illustrates quite clearly that in 2019 through to 2023, there has been an increased number of deaths. And this one is putting them all together and illustrating the number of deaths. The blue one at the top is COVID. Interesting, as we see that the arrival of the COVID happened in 2020, but the arrival of the vaccine happened in 2021. The second one down there, the yellowish one, says it's drug poisoning. I'm not sure exactly, they didn't define what that meant, but one thing that is clear and is not mentioned in any of these statistics is what we call death and excess deaths through iatrogenic reasons, in other words, doctor-induced reasons, and those can be medications, they can be methods that were deemed to be appropriate to assist someone's situation that actually worsened it or caused deaths. I think what is very interesting at the end of the, obviously they have the data, everyone knows there's been excess deaths, but it's very interesting what the report gives reasons for the excess deaths, and it doesn't mention at all any iatrogenic intervention. And iatrogenic means any intervention, medical intervention, whether it be doctors or medications or things like that, because obviously when you present with a condition to a doctor, he is going to give you perhaps something to try and alleviate that, and depending on what you present and whether it's something that's known or whether that's something that's novel, obviously sometimes either individually or collectively the medical system apply or try out something. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. In relation to COVID, of course, this was deemed to be novel, and to some extent it was. Therefore, and for the risk and the number of people who were falling ill, some novel iatrogenic medicines and interventions were undertaken. And I think it would not be unreasonable to state that not all the interventions undertaken, for whatever goodwill and justifiable reasons they were undertaken at the time, resulted in the most positive of outcomes for patients. One amongst that would be the use of ventilators, where there is a fair bit of data that says that ventilators, let's say, were not the most ideal thing that you wanted to be put on if you were in hospital suffering from COVID. So again, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope it's been informative, and we will be speaking to you again soon. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.